The sterile quiet of the 40th floor boardroom was a sacred thing, a silence bought and paid for by billions of dollars and the crushed aspirations of lesser companies. Alistair Vance, CEO of a tech empire that touched nearly every screen on the planet, stood before a wall of smoked glass that overlooked a city reduced to a schematic. He was a man carved from the same material as the skyscraper that housed him, cold, precise, and offering no purchase for sentiment. Inside the room, his board members sat like well-dressed statues, their attention fixed on the quarterly projections, glowing on the holographic display in the center of the massive obsidian table. Alistair was in the middle of a sentence, a blade of a sentence meant to trim the fat from their European logistics division, when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open. It wasn't a dramatic swing, but in that vacuum of sound, it was a gunshot. Heads turned, Alistair's included, his annoyance a flicker of heat in his cool gray eyes. A junior security guard, pale and sweating, stood frozen in the doorway, his hand hovering uselessly near the handle. And in front of him, stepping into the hallowed space with an air of impossible confidence, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with a mass of tangled brown curls, a faded pink dress, and a smudge of what looked like chocolate on her cheek. In her small hand, she clutched a crumpled, cream-colored envelope. She ignored the gasping board members and the panicked guard. Her gaze, startlingly direct and the color of moss after a rain, scanned the room before landing squarely on Alistair. She took a few more steps forward, her worn sneakers silent on the plush carpet, and held out the letter. "Are you Alistair Vance?" she asked, her voice clear and small but unwavering. "My mommy said you have to read this. She said you're my daddy." The silence that followed was no longer sacred. It was a suffocating, dense thing, filled with the unspoken shock of a dozen of the most powerful people in the city. Alistair felt a bizarre disconnect, as if he were watching this scene from behind the smoked glass of his window. The child, the dress, the absurd, impossible accusation. His mind, a finely tuned machine for data and strategy, cycled through possibilities and discarded them all. Corporate espionage, a tasteless prank by a rival, a shakedown, it was all noise. The one piece of data he held with absolute certainty, the bedrock of his solitary life, was that he was sterile. A bout of mumps in his late teens had left him with a zero-count prognosis, a fact confirmed by a battery of tests when he was 22 and foolishly in love. He could not have a child. It was a biological impossibility. The girl just stood there, her arm outstretched, the letter a flag of surrender or a declaration of war. He couldn't tell which. His head of security, Marcus Thorne, a man whose presence was usually as subtle as a change in air pressure, materialized by the door. He was already speaking quietly into his wrist, his eyes like chips of flint, assessing the breach. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the paralysis. "Apologies. We're handling this." 2 more guards, larger and more imposing, entered the room. They moved not toward the child, but toward the perimeter, a silent, professional containment. Alistair finally found his voice. It was colder than usual, brittle. "Get her out of here," he commanded, his gaze sweeping over the board members, a silent order to forget what they had just seen and heard. He refused to look at the child again, at those impossibly green eyes. The junior guard, finally spurred to action, scurried forward and gently took the girl's arm. She didn't resist, but she didn't drop her hand either. The letter remained extended toward him, a persistent, silent question. As they guided her out of the room, her small voice floated back. "You're supposed to read it!" The oak doors clicked shut, and the silence returned, but it was irrevocably broken. It was now filled with the echo of a child's voice and an accusation that struck at the very foundation of the man he knew himself to be. The holographic projections shimmered, forgotten. The faces around the table were carefully blank, but Alistair could feel their curiosity, their speculation, burning into him. He turned back to the window, his jaw so tight it ached. Below, the city moved on, oblivious. But here, on the 40th floor, the world had tilted on its axis. He had built his life on certainty, on facts and figures. And the one fact he had always leaned on, his sterile solitude, had just been challenged by a 6-year-old in a faded pink dress. Marcus entered the room and approached him, holding the crumpled cream envelope. He held it as if it might be a bomb. "Sir," Marcus said softly, "she's with a social worker in my office. The mother isn't with her. She says her name is Lily." Alistair didn't turn. He stared at his own reflection in the glass. A man perfectly tailored, perfectly composed, and suddenly completely unknown to himself. "The letter," Alistair said, his voice flat. Marcus placed it on the obsidian table. It lay there, a small wrinkled thing in the vast, polished emptiness. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit, and Alistair Vance hated anomalies more than anything. The rest of the board meeting was a masterclass in control. Alistair, with chilling precision, returned to the European Logistics Division, his voice never wavering, his arguments as sharp as ever. He dissected spreadsheets, outlined strategies, and secured their unanimous approval for his plan. Anyone watching would have thought the interruption was a minor, bizarre footnote. But beneath the surface of his composure, his mind was a storm. Every number he read was superimposed with the image of a small, determined face. Every strategic projection was tainted by the memory of 2 moss-green eyes. When the meeting finally adjourned and the board members filed out with quiet, respectful nods, Alistair remained at the head of the table, staring at the envelope. Marcus stood by the door, a silent sentinel. "What do we know?" Alistair asked, not looking up. "The girl's name is Lily Rowe. Age 7, according to the social worker she was handed off to. The mother is Elena Rowe. The girl says her mother is sick. She was given a bus pass and told to come to this building, find the man on the top floor, and give him the letter. That's it." The name hit Alistair like a physical blow, a ghost from a life he had intentionally buried 2 decades ago. Elena, his Elena, the artist with paint in her hair and a laugh that could fill a cavernous loft. The woman he had loved with a terrifying, all-consuming passion before he had learned to love profit margins and market share. The woman he had left behind because her dreams of a quiet life painting by the sea were incompatible with his insatiable hunger to build an empire. He hadn't heard her name in nearly 20 years. He had insured it. He had scrubbed his life of her, of the weakness she represented. And now her name was on the lips of his head of security, attached to a 7-year-old child who claimed he was her father. "Find her," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "Find Elena Rowe. I want to know everything. Where she lives, what she does, who she's been with for the last 8 years. Everything, Marcus. And the letter? Marcus asked, his gaze on the small, wrinkled object that held the power to unravel them all. Alistair finally reached out, his long fingers closing around the thin paper. It was warm, as if it still held the heat from the child's hand. He could feel the fold of a thick letter inside. For a moment, he considered incinerating it, erasing this entire, insane episode from existence. But he couldn't. The data was on the table. It had to be analyzed. "Leave me," he said. Marcus nodded and slipped out of the room, the door closing with a soft, final thud. Alistair was alone again, in his silent, 40th floor kingdom. He stared at the envelope. His name was not on it. There was no address. It was a message meant to be hand-delivered. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he tore it open. The handwriting was instantly, painfully familiar. It was the same elegant, looping script that had filled the margins of his college textbooks with poetry and silly cartoons. It was Elena's. "My dearest Alistair, if you are reading this, it means my Lily has found you. It means she was brave enough, and the world was kind enough, to let her complete this one last journey for me. I'm sorry. I know that's a pathetic way to begin a letter that carries the weight of a life, but my heart is overflowing with sorrow. Sorrow for the years we lost, sorrow for the secrets I kept, and most of all, sorrow for the pain this will inevitably cause you. I imagine you are confused, angry. I imagine your logical mind is screaming that this is impossible. You told me once, on a rainy Tuesday, in your dorm room, about the mumps, about the doctors. You told me you could never have children. You were so certain. But do you remember that other conversation? A few months later, at that little clinic off campus? We were young and ridiculously in love, talking about a future that seemed both infinite and immediate. We were talking about possibilities, and you were worried. The doctor, a kind woman with a reassuring smile, suggested a precaution, a just-in-case, a way to preserve a piece of that future if we ever needed it. We paid a few $100s we barely had, signed the forms, and you left a part of yourself behind a frosted glass door. We laughed about it on the way home, calling it our little insurance policy on a dream. Then, a year later, you left me. You chose the company, the dream of an empire, over our small, simple dream. I don't blame you, not anymore. You were built for conquest, and I was built for quiet shores. I was heartbroken, shattered, but I understood. I tried to move on. I traveled, I painted, I even tried to love again. But there was always a void where you had been. Years passed. The silence from you was absolute. I heard about your success, saw your face on magazine covers. You were a king in a world I no longer recognized, and I was so desperately lonely. One day, I found the old paperwork from that clinic, our little insurance policy. It was a mad impulse, born of loneliness, and a fading hope that maybe, just maybe, if I had a piece of you, it would be enough. I didn't think it would work, but it did. 9 months later, I had Lily. Our Lily. She is the best part of both of us, Alistair. She has your fierce intelligence, your determination, those serious gray eyes that see right through people. But she has my heart, my love for color and stories and the sound of the ocean. I never told you because I was ashamed, and I was proud. I didn't want your money. I didn't want to be a footnote in your structured life. I wanted you to come back for me, not for a child you never knew you had. But you never came. Now there is no time left. The cancer in my bones is no longer a secret I can keep. The doctors have given me weeks, perhaps a month. And my only fear, my only consuming terror, is leaving Lily alone. She has no one else. You are her only family. I am not asking for your love. I am not even asking for your forgiveness. I am begging you to do what you have always done, better than anyone. Protect your legacy. She is your legacy, Alistair. Not your buildings, not your code, not your stock price. This beautiful, brave little girl. Her name is Lillian, after the flowers you once brought me. She loves grilled cheese sandwiches, with the crusts cut off, the color yellow, and stories about dragons who are secretly sad. She is afraid of thunderstorms and clowns. Her heart is the most precious thing in this world. Please, Alistair, don't let her be alone. Yours, always. Elena. Alistair read the letter once, then twice, then a third time. The boardroom seemed to shrink around him, the air growing thick and heavy. The words on the page were an assault, a rewriting of his entire personal history. The clinic. He remembered it now, a vague, hazy memory, shrouded in the optimism of youth. It had felt like a game, a romantic gesture. It hadn't seemed real. He had forgotten about it completely, burying it along with every other memory of Elena. He looked at his hands, which were trembling. He who could command markets and bend competitors to his will was trembling because of a ghost's handwriting and a half-forgotten memory. The foundations of his life were not just cracked, they had been pulverized. He wasn't childless. He was a father to a 7-year-old girl who liked yellow and sad dragons. A knot of something unfamiliar and agonizingly tight formed in his chest. It was a toxic cocktail of rage, grief, and a profound, terrifying sense of loss. He was enraged at Elena for her deception, for keeping his own child from him for 7 years. He grieved for the woman he had loved, who was now dying. And he was lost, utterly adrift, in the ruins of the life he thought he knew. He had spent 2 decades building an empire of solitude, convincing himself that it was what he wanted, that it was all he was capable of. And in one afternoon, it had all been revealed as a monumental lie. He had not been alone at all. A part of him, a living, breathing part, had been in the world all this time. And he had missed it. He had missed everything. The first step, the first word, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He walked to the window and stared down at the city, but he didn't see it. He saw a little girl with moss-green eyes and a crumpled letter offering him a life he never knew he had lost. Marcus's report came the next morning. It was delivered in a sleek, encrypted file, but the contents were anything but clean. Elena Rowe lived in a 5th-floor walk-up, in a crumbling neighborhood on the far side of the city, a place Alistair's limousine would have looked like a visiting spaceship. She was registered as a freelance artist, but her income records were sporadic at best. Her medical file was a brutal confirmation of the letter's claims. Metastatic bone cancer, with a prognosis that was grimly short. There were photos. One showed Elena, impossibly thin and pale. Her once vibrant hair now sparse and brittle. She was sitting on a park bench, and even through the long-distance lens, Alistair could see the pain etched on her face. But she was smiling. Her smile was directed at the subject of the next photo, Lily. The girl was laughing, chasing a flock of pigeons, her tangled curls flying behind her. She was a spark of pure, unadulterated life. Alistair stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the line of her jaw, the shape of her nose. He saw a ghost of his own mother in her smile, a hint of his own intensity in her focused gaze as she zeroed in on a particularly fat pigeon. He closed the file. The data was in. It was time to act. He didn't formulate a plan. For the first time in his professional life, Alistair Vance had no strategy, no flowchart of outcomes. He was operating on a single, raw impulse. He had to see them. He told his driver to take him to the address in the file, a part of the city he had only ever flown over. The gleaming towers of his financial district gave way to low-slung brick buildings, their facades grimy with decades of exhaust. The streets were narrower, crowded with people whose faces showed the strain of lives lived without the safety net of extreme wealth. The car, a custom-built armored sedan, was so out of place that people stopped and stared as it purred to a stop in front of a tenement building with a broken stoop and graffiti snaking up its walls. Alistair got out, his $1,000 suit a ridiculous costume in this setting. The air smelled of fried food and damp concrete. He found the apartment number and began to climb. There was no elevator. The stairs creaked under his expensive leather shoes, and the hallways were dim, lit by single, fly-specked bulbs. By the time he reached the 5th floor, he was breathing heavily, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. He stood before apartment 5B, its green paint peeling, a small hand-painted sign on the door that read, "The Row Residence," with a crudely drawn sunflower next to it. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What was he going to say? What could he possibly say? He knocked. The door opened a crack, held by a brass chain. A pair of familiar green eyes peered out at him. It was Lily. She wasn't wearing the pink dress from yesterday. Today it was a pair of overalls with a yellow and white striped shirt underneath. She looked him up and down, her expression one of solemn curiosity. "You came," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Did you read it?" "Yes," Alistair managed to say, his throat dry. "I read it." "Mommy's sleeping," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The medicine makes her sleepy. You have to be quiet." She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. Alistair stepped inside, and his world contracted to the size of this small, cluttered room. It was a single space that served as a living room, kitchen, and studio. Canvases of all sizes were stacked against one wall, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the worn-out furniture. The room was clean, but crowded with the ephemera of a life lived on a shoestring budget. Mismatched mugs, stacks of books, a half-finished puzzle on a rickety coffee table, and everywhere there was the smell of turpentine and something sweet, like cinnamon. A thin curtain separated off a small alcove, and from behind it he could hear the sound of shallow, labored breathing. That must be where Elena slept. Lily pointed to a lumpy armchair. "You can sit there," she instructed. "Do you want some juice?" Alistair, the man who had private chefs cater to his every culinary whim, found himself sitting in a faded floral armchair, a plastic cup of apple juice in his hand. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor in front of him, studying him with an unnerving intensity. "You look like the pictures," she said finally. "What pictures?" "The ones Mommy has, in a box, from when you were both young. You had more hair then." Alistair felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. "Your mother, she told you about me?" "Sometimes," Lily said, shrugging. "She said you were a builder, that you built big, shiny castles in the sky. She said you got lost in one of them." The simple, childish description was so accurate it felt like a punch to the gut. He had gotten lost. He had built a castle so high he could no longer see the ground. What did she tell you about me being your father? He asked, the word feeling alien on his tongue. She just said you were. She said you were half of me, just like she was the other half. And she said you were a good man, even if you forgot how to be. A soft moan came from behind the curtain. Lily's head snapped toward the sound. Mommy's waking up. She scrambled to her feet and disappeared behind the curtain. Alistair heard her small voice, soft and reassuring. It's okay, Mommy. I'm here. He could hear a weaker, raspier voice reply, the words indistinct. After a moment, Lily reappeared. She wants to see you, she said. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked the few steps to the alcove and pulled back the curtain. The woman lying in the small bed was a cruel caricature of the Elena he remembered. Her face was gaunt. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and the vibrant life that had once danced in her green eyes was now a dim, flickering ember. But it was her, and when she saw him, a faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Hello, Alistair," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery thing. "You got my letter?" He stood there, mute, a torrent of unspoken words dammed up behind his lips. "Sorry." "Why? How could you? I missed you. I hate you. I loved you." None of them seemed adequate. Elena seemed to read the conflict in his face. "I know you're angry," she said, her breathing shallow. "You have every right to be. It was a selfish, cowardly thing to do." 7 years, Elena, he finally said, his voice raw. "You let me believe for 7 years that I was nothing to anyone." "You were never nothing," she rasped, a flash of the old fire in her eyes. "You were a titan, a king. What would a king do with a secret child from a life he'd thrown away? I was protecting her, and I was protecting myself from having my heart broken by you a second time." Lily, who had been standing by the bed, reached out and took her mother's hand. She looked from Elena to Alistair, her small face a mirror of confusion and concern. "Is he mad?" she asked her mother. "No, sweet pea," Elena said, her gaze softening as she looked at her daughter. "He's just surprised. It's a very big surprise." Alistair looked at the child, at this small person who was a stranger, and yet was flesh of his flesh. He saw the fierce, protective love in Elena's eyes as she looked at her, and the raw, unadulterated adoration in Lily's as she looked back. He was an intruder here, a foreign element in their small, complete world. This was a family, and he had missed it all. The weight of those 7 lost years pressed down on him, a physical, crushing force. He had traded this love, this connection. For what? Another billion? A taller building? A more efficient supply chain? The thought was so absurd, so obscene, that a laugh, harsh and humorless, escaped his lips. Elena flinched. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, the sound dying in his throat. I don't know what to do." "I do," Elena said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You are going to get to know your daughter, and you are going to let her get to know you. And when I'm gone, you are going to love her enough for the both of us." The words were a command, an absolution, and a curse all at once. "When I'm gone." The finality of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Alistair looked at Lily, who was now watching him with an expression of cautious hope. Her trust was a fragile, terrifying thing. He had never been responsible for anything so delicate. He had managed portfolios worth more than the GDP of small countries, but he had no idea how to manage the heart of a 7-year-old girl. A fit of coughing seized Elena, a deep, rattling sound that shook her thin frame. Lily immediately grabbed a glass of water with a straw from the bedside table and held it to her mother's lips. The gesture was so practiced, so filled with a maturity far beyond her years, that it broke something deep inside Alistair. This little girl had been a caregiver, a nursemaid, when she should have been playing with dolls. "She needs better care," Alistair said, the words coming out as a clipped command. It was the only way he knew how to process the overwhelming emotion, turn it into a logistical problem. "A hospital, the best doctors. I'll arrange everything." Elena shook her head weakly, a tear tracing a path through the gaunt landscape of her face. "It's too late for that, Alistair. The doctors have done all they can. All I want is to be here with her until the end." "No," he said, the word a stark denial of the reality in front of him. "I don't accept that." He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, already contacting his personal physician, the head of the best oncology department in the country. He would fix this. He would throw money at it until it was fixed. It's what he did. It was who he was. "Alistair, stop," Elena whispered. He ignored her, his voice low and urgent, as he spoke into the phone. He was arranging for a private ambulance, a suite at the most exclusive hospital, a team of specialists to be on standby. When he hung up, he felt a sliver of his old control returning. He was back on familiar ground, solving an unsolvable problem. But when he looked up, he saw the pity in Elena's eyes. "You can't buy your way out of this one," she said softly. "Some things are not negotiable." Her words stripped away his momentary sense of power, leaving him exposed and helpless again. He looked at the peeling paint on the walls, the stack of canvases that were the sum total of a life's work, the small brave child standing guard over her dying mother. And for the first time, Alistair Vance, the man who had everything, understood what it meant to be truly poor. The days that followed were a surreal blur. Alistair, against his every instinct, did not move Elena to a hospital. She refused, and he found, to his astonishment, that he could not force her. He could acquire a rival company with a single phone call, but he could not make this frail woman do something she didn't want to do. Instead, he brought the hospital to her. Within 24 hours, the dingy apartment was transformed. A state-of-the-art hospital bed replaced her old mattress. IV drips and monitors were installed by a team of discreet private nurses who worked in quiet, efficient shifts. The best palliative care doctor in the state made house calls. Alistair paid for it all without a second thought, the sums of money meaningless to him. He was trying to sandbag a tsunami with $100 bills. During this time, he existed in a strange limbo between his two worlds. By day, he would go to his office, sit in his 40th floor fortress, and command his empire. He was sharp, ruthless, his mind a steel trap. But the numbers and strategies felt hollow, the victories empty. Then, in the afternoon, he would get in his car and be driven back to the other side of the city, to the small apartment that now smelled of antiseptic and cinnamon. He would step into that cluttered room and cease to be a CEO. He would become something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. He was an awkward, hovering presence. He didn't know how to talk to Elena. The 20 years of silence between them was a chasm too wide to bridge with small talk. Their conversations were stilted, fraught with unspoken accusations and regrets. But with Lily, it was different. She accepted his presence with a child's simple logic. He was her father, so he was here. That was that. She would sit on the floor and draw, occasionally holding up a picture for his inspection. They were usually of a yellow sun, a smiling stick figure mother, and a new, taller stick figure with a tie standing beside them. She would ask him questions, blunt and direct. Why is your car so shiny? Do you know any magic tricks? Why don't you smile? He answered them as best he could, his replies often clumsy and overly literal. He found himself explaining the physics of metallic paint, the principles of misdirection, and the complexities of corporate responsibility, all to a 7-year-old who would just blink her big green eyes and nod as if she understood perfectly. One afternoon, he arrived to find her struggling with a math worksheet at the small kitchen table. She chewed on the end of her pencil, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What's this?" he asked, looking over her shoulder. "Times tables," she grumbled. "They're stupid." He looked at the sheet. It was multiplication. He saw the problem she was stuck on, 7x8. "It's 56, he said automatically. She looked up at him, unimpressed. "Mrs. Davison says we have to show our work. We have to understand it." Alistair paused. Understand it. It was a concept he applied to business, not to something as simple as multiplication. He pulled up a chair. "Okay," he said, "think of it this way. You have 7 friends, and you want to give each of them 8 cookies. How many cookies do you need?" Lily's eyes lit up. "A lot." "Right," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "So you can count it out. 8, 16, 24. He spent the next hour not just giving her the answers, but explaining the logic behind them, drawing arrays of dots, showing her the patterns. And for that hour, he wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a stranger. He was just a father helping his daughter with her homework. When they were finished, Lily beamed at him, a proud, gap-toothed smile. "You're good at that," she said. "You should be a teacher." The comment, so innocent and sincere, struck him with an odd force. He, a teacher. It was the last thing he would have ever called himself. But as he looked at the completed worksheet, he felt a sense of satisfaction that dwarfed any he'd ever felt closing a multi-billion-dollar deal. Elena watched these interactions from her bed, her expression a mixture of pain and peace. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on a small cot Alistair had brought in for her, Elena called him over. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her eyes glistening. "For what?" "For this. For trying. I see you with her, Alistair. The man I fell in love with is still in there, under all that armor. I don't know what I'm doing, Elena." "Neither did I," she confessed. "No parent does. You just love them, fiercely. And you do your best not to mess them up too badly. You're doing okay." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft beep of the medical monitors and the gentle rhythm of Lily's breathing. "Tell me about her," he said suddenly. "Tell me what I missed." "And so," Elena told him, in a voice that grew weaker by the day, she painted a portrait of the 7 years he had been absent. She told him about Lily's first word, Kitty, her first steps, which ended in a collision with the couch, her first day of school. She cried. Elena cried more. She told him about her daughter's fierce loyalty, her surprising empathy, her stubborn refusal to eat peas. She told him about their trips to the beach, where Lily would collect shells for hours, and their Sunday morning tradition of making pancakes, which usually resulted in more batter on the floor than in the pan. As he listened, Alistair felt the ghost of that lost time wrap around him. Each story was a gift, but it was also a stab of regret. He was learning about his daughter's life, like one might read a biography, a collection of historical facts about a stranger. He hadn't been there to see it, to feel it. He had been in boardrooms, on private jets, in sterile hotel suites, building his shiny, empty castle. The rage he had felt toward Elena began to soften, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. He understood now why she had done it. She had given her daughter a life, a happy, love-filled life, despite the shadows of poverty and illness. She had done it all on her own, and he had done nothing. The DNA test was a formality he'd insisted upon in the first few days, a nod to his rational, evidence-based world. Marcus had arranged for a discreet rush sample collection. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon, delivered to Alistair's office in a sealed envelope. He already knew what they would say. He didn't need a laboratory to tell him that the little girl with his mother's smile and his own stubborn determination was his daughter. But seeing it in black and white, probability of paternity, 99. 99% was still a shock. It was the final, irrevocable data point. The old Alistair Vance was a fiction. This was the new reality. He was a father. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He walked out of his office, past his stunned assistant, and took the elevator down to the garage. He didn't go back to the apartment that day. He drove. He didn't have a destination. He just drove, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. He was running, but he didn't know what from. His past, his future, himself. He ended up at the ocean, a place he hadn't been since he was with Elena. He got out of the car and walked onto the sand. The cold, salty air whipped at him, a clean, sharp scent that was the antithesis of his climate-controlled life. He stood at the edge of the water, the waves crashing and receding at his feet, and he finally let himself feel the full, crushing weight of it all. The grief for Elena, the regret for the lost years, the terror of the future. He was 45 years old, and he was starting over. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know how to raise a child, how to soothe her fears, how to celebrate her triumphs. He didn't know how to build a home, only a headquarters. A wave washed over his expensive shoes, soaking them through, but he didn't move. He stood there for a long time, letting the vast, indifferent ocean wash away the man he had been, leaving only the raw, uncertain truth of who he had to become. When he returned to the apartment late that night, the lights were dim. A night nurse sat reading in a chair, and she gave him a solemn nod. Lily was asleep on her cot. He walked over to Elena's bed. She was awake, her eyes open and staring at the ceiling. She seemed to be waiting for him. "Where were you?" she whispered. "I was worried." He pulled a chair close to her bed. He took her frail, cool hand in his. "The results came back," he said quietly. "I know," she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I never had any doubt." "I'm scared, Elena," he admitted, the words feeling foreign and shameful. He was Alistair Vance. He did not do scared. "Good," she said, her grip surprisingly strong. "It means you understand what's at stake." He stayed with her all night, holding her hand as her breathing grew more shallow, more erratic. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. All the anger, the regrets, the what-ifs, They had all been stripped away, leaving only this quiet, profound sadness. In the cold, gray hours just before dawn, she opened her eyes and looked at him. Her gaze was clear, the pain momentarily gone. "Sing to her," she whispered. "What?" "Lily, when she has bad dreams, I sing her the song about the crooked man. She loves it." And then, with a final, gentle sigh, Elena was gone. The medical monitor flatlined, its single piercing tone an obscene scream in the quiet room. The nurse moved quickly, professionally, but Alistair just sat there, frozen, still holding Elena's hand, which was already growing cold. The sound woke Lily. She sat up on her cot, rubbing her eyes. "What's that noise?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Alistair looked at his daughter, her face bathed in the sterile, flashing light of the monitor, and his heart shattered into a million pieces. He had to tell her. He, the man who had fired hundreds of people with detached efficiency, had to find the words to tell this little girl that her entire world had just ended. He crossed the room and switched off the horrible machine. The silence that rushed in was even worse. He knelt by her cot and took her small, warm hands in his. Her green eyes, so like her mother's, were wide and questioning. And in that moment, Alistair Vance did the only thing he could think of. He began to sing, his voice cracking and off-key. There was a crooked man, and he walked a crooked mile. Lily stared at him, her lip beginning to tremble as the terrible understanding dawned on her face. But she didn't cry. Not yet. She just listened, as her father, a broken man in a $1,000 suit, sang a nursery rhyme to her in the dark. The funeral was a small private affair. Alistair had wanted to arrange something grand, a testament to the woman he had belatedly remembered he loved, but he knew Elena would have hated it. Instead, he found a small, green cemetery by the sea, the place she had always dreamed of. There were only 3 people in attendance: Alistair, a silent and stoic Marcus, and Lily. Lily wore a simple black dress Alistair had bought for her. She held his hand tightly the entire time, her small fingers a lifeline in his sea of grief. She didn't cry. She stood by the graveside, her face pale and serious, and watched as they lowered the simple wooden casket into the earth. Alistair read a poem Elena had loved, his voice thick with unshed tears. When it was over, Lily let go of his hand. She walked to the edge of the grave and dropped a single bright yellow sunflower onto the casket. "For you, Mommy," she whispered. Then she turned, walked back to Alistair, and took his hand again. And it was only then, as they walked away from the grave, that she finally began to cry, her small body shaking with silent, racking sobs. Alistair picked her up and held her, his own tears finally falling, mingling with hers in the salty sea air. He held her as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the universe, because to him she was. She was all he had left of Elena. She was all he had left, period. In the weeks that followed, Alistair's world was completely remade. He moved Lily into his penthouse apartment, a place of minimalist design, priceless art, and echoing silence. It was the worst possible environment for a grieving child. Lily's presence was an explosion of color and chaos in his monochromatic life. Her toys colonized the living room floor. Her brightly colored drawings were taped to the stainless steel refrigerator. Her laughter, when it finally returned, was a foreign, beautiful sound in the quiet halls. Alistair was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. He had no idea how to be a full-time parent. He tried to apply business principles to the problem. He hired a fleet of staff, a nanny, a child psychologist, a tutor, a chef who specialized in nutritious, kid-friendly meals. He scheduled Lily's days with the same precision he scheduled his board meetings. Breakfast at 8 kyaw, tutoring at 9 kyaw, educational play at 11 kyaws, lunch at 12:30. It was a disaster. Lily grew quiet and withdrawn. She hated the nanny, who was too cheerful. She refused to talk to the psychologist. She hid from the tutor. She pushed away the perfectly balanced meals the chef prepared, asking only for grilled cheese sandwiches. One evening, Alistair came home from a grueling day at the office to find Lily sitting on the floor of her enormous, beautifully decorated bedroom, surrounded by expensive dolls she hadn't touched. She was just staring at the wall. The nanny, a kind woman named Clara, met him at the door, her face etched with worry. "She hasn't said a word all afternoon, Mr. Vance. She just wants you." Alistair felt a familiar surge of panic and inadequacy. He dismissed Clara for the night and walked into Lily's room. He sat on the floor beside her, the silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. "Lily," he said finally, "talk to me." She didn't look at him. "You're not here," she said, her voice small. "What do you mean?" "I'm right here." "No, you're not," she said, finally turning to look at him, her eyes accusing. "You're at your castle, your work. You're always at your castle." Her words, a direct echo of her mother's, hit him hard. She was right. He had outsourced her upbringing, just as he outsourced every other part of his life that wasn't his company. He had given her everything money could buy, except the one thing she actually needed: him. That night, he made a decision. The next morning, he walked into his office and informed his board that he was taking a leave of absence. Indefinite. The announcement sent shock waves through the company and the financial world. Alistair Vance, the workaholic, the man who hadn't taken a vacation in 20 years, was stepping down. They thought he was sick, or that the scandal of his secret daughter had finally broken him. He let them think it. He didn't care. For the first time in his life, his company was not his priority. He went home and fired the entire staff. He fired the nanny, the psychologist, the tutor, the chef. That evening, he stood in his gleaming, industrial-grade kitchen, and, with the help of a video on the internet, he made Lily a grilled cheese sandwich. He burned the first one. The second one was a little lopsided, but he cut the crusts off, just as Elena's letter had said, and served it to her on a simple plate. Lily took a bite. A slow smile spread across her face. "It's good," she said. It was the first real smile he had seen from her in weeks. It was a victory more profound than any IPO. Their new life was messy, unstructured, and often chaotic. Alistair learned how to braid hair badly. He learned that 7-year-olds can ask approximately 400 questions per hour. He learned that slime, once made, has a way of getting onto every conceivable surface. He learned how to build elaborate Lego castles and how to lose gracefully at Candyland. He learned that Lily was terrified of thunderstorms. The first time a big one rolled in, she began to tremble, her face pale. He remembered Elena's letter. He took her into his arms, sat in the big armchair by the window, and held her tight. He told her stories about the sky giants who were just bowling and promised her she was safe. He stayed with her until the storm passed, his presence a shield against her fear. And he learned that she missed her mother with a pain that was a constant, physical presence. One night, he found her crying in her bed, clutching a small, worn teddy bear. "I miss Mommy," she sobbed into his chest. "I want her back." Alistair held her, his own grief a fresh, raw wound. "I know," he whispered into her hair. "I miss her too, so much." He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just sat with her in her sadness, sharing the immense weight of their loss. They were two crooked people, walking a crooked mile together, finding their way in the dark. Slowly, miraculously, a routine began to form, one born not of schedules and efficiency, but of their shared needs. They had breakfast together every morning. He drove her to school, a simple public school he had enrolled her in, and he was the one who picked her up at the end of the day. They did homework at the kitchen table. They cooked dinner together, often making a spectacular mess. They read stories before bed. He was no longer just a CEO on leave. He was a dad. His penthouse, once a sterile showpiece, became a home. Lily's artwork was framed and hung on the walls, replacing the abstract, expensive paintings. A sprawling, half-finished puzzle took up permanent residence on his coffee table. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Lily's laughter and the endless loop of her favorite cartoon theme songs. His world had shrunk from a global empire to the dimensions of a little girl's life. And yet, for the first time, it felt infinitely large. One Saturday, they went to the beach, the same one where Elena was buried. They didn't visit the grave. Instead, they walked along the shoreline, collecting shells, just as Elena had described in her stories. Lily, with the uncanny wisdom of a child, seemed to know that this was a pilgrimage of sorts. She found a perfect world conch shell and held it up to Alistair's ear. "You can hear the ocean," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. Alistair listened. He heard the rush of the sea, but he also heard the echo of Elena's laugh, the memory of a love he thought he had lost forever. He looked at his daughter, her face bright with sunshine and sea spray, her tangled hair whipping in the wind. She was the perfect combination of the woman he had lost and the man he was becoming. She was his past and his future, all wrapped up in one small, miraculous package. That evening, as he was tucking her into bed, she threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered into his ear. The words, so simple and so pure, landed in the center of his chest and healed a wound he hadn't even known was there. He held her close, overwhelmed by a wave of love so fierce, so powerful, it almost brought him to his knees. "I love you too, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than all the shiny castles in the sky." He had lost an empire, but he had gained the world. A few months later, Alistair returned to work. But he was not the same man who had left. He walked into the boardroom, the same room where his life had been upended, and saw it with new eyes. He saw a room full of people who, like him, had families, children, lives that existed outside these glass walls. His first act as returning CEO was not to discuss quarterly earnings, but to announce a complete overhaul of the company's family leave policy, making it the most generous in the industry. He established on-site child care and flexible work hours. He told his executives that no meeting was more important than a school play, no deadline more critical than a sick child. Some of them were baffled. Others were relieved. But they all saw the change in him. The cold, driven machine had been replaced by a man with a quiet strength. A man who now understood that the most valuable asset in any portfolio was time. He still worked hard, but he no longer worked late. At 5 o'clock sharp, he would pack his briefcase and go home. He would go home to a messy, chaotic apartment filled with laughter. He would go home to a little girl who was waiting for him. He would go home. One evening, Lily was looking at the old box of photos, the one her mother had kept. She pulled one out. It was of Alistair and Elena in college, sitting on a park bench, laughing, their heads close together. They were young, full of hope, with no idea of the long, crooked road that lay ahead of them. "Mommy looks happy," Lily said softly. "She was," Alistair said, his heart aching with a sweet, familiar sadness. "We both were." "She said you were a good man, even if you forgot how to be," Lily recited, her memory perfect. "Did you remember?" Alistair looked at his daughter, at her beautiful, trusting face, at her moss-green eyes that held the entire history of his heart. He thought of the empty years, the lonely triumphs, the kingdom of solitude he had so carefully constructed. And he thought of the joy, the chaos, the fierce, unconditional love that had torn it all down and built something real in its place. He pulled her onto his lap and hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint, lingering smell of cinnamon that always seemed to follow her, a ghostly reminder of the woman who had given them both a second chance. "Yes," he whispered into her hair, "thanks to you, I remembered." He had finally found his way out of the castle, not by building it higher, but by learning that the greatest treasures were not locked inside its walls, but were waiting patiently on the other side of the door, in the small, warm hand of a child. This story explores the profound transformation of a man who discovers the true meaning of wealth and legacy. It's a reminder that the most important connections in our lives are often the ones we least expect, and that love has the power to redeem and rebuild even the most broken of hearts. What did you find most moving about Alistair's journey from a cold-hearted CEO to a loving father?